they're having a somewhat embodied experience. They're feeling some of the pleasure, but oftentimes all the emphasis is on the orgasm, and there's not, or the climax. And so there's not necessarily an orgasmic experience throughout. It's like building to this one moment rather than getting to take in all the goodness of the entire experience, whether that's sex on your own or with a partner or partners. So the first step is really to start to bring your attention to your body.
So welcome to the Give and Consent podcast. The goal behind this show is to introduce you to the people and ideas behind sex positivity. And today I am joined by Jessica Graham. Thanks for being with me today.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited to talk to you because as part of what I do with Sex Positive, we do a book club, and we just recently read your book, Good Sex, which I have here with me. It was a good read. And I wanted to dive into a lot of the concepts behind it because you're not only someone who teaches about relationships and meditation and mindfulness, which we'll dive into. I know that you're also doing filmmaking and acting and counseling with people. So you're kind of the expert behind connecting that mind-body experience and then also healing trauma that comes. So I think where I want to start is around mindfulness, because one of the first concepts in your book is this idea that we kind of have this concept that you get out your little pillow and your yoga mat, and that's where the meditation happens. And I love that you break it down for anyone to do it. So can you talk a little bit about like what you're talking about there in terms of getting a meditation practice started and what the benefit of that is?
Absolutely. So yeah, the number one thing that people say when they're trying to begin a meditation practice is, I'm doing it wrong. In some way, people feel like they're doing it wrong. They feel like their mind is too noisy, or they're meditating not long enough, or they're doing the wrong practice, or there's always this sense of like, not always, but a lot of the time, this sense of it not being done correctly. And so the first thing that I like to say is, there are so many different ways to practice, and you find what feels good for you, and then really let go of this idea that you have to get it right. There may be some teachers and some traditions that say there is this correct way, but that's not how I roll. So the first thing is to find a practice that works for you. The thing I love about mindfulness is that there's a lot of different options within the practice of mindfulness. And you can also bring mindfulness into your day-to-day, which is a really important aspect of it, because meditation doesn't just happen on the cushion. In fact, my life really changed when I brought the meditation practice, the mindfulness practice, into my day-to-day life, into my relationships, and ultimately into sex. So if you're wanting to get a practice started, there are tons of apps now, that can support you with that. I know a lot of people like Insight Timer. I'm a contributor on Simple Habit, which, offers meditations for just about everything. And some of my mindful sex practices are on there. And actually, if you go to my website, there's on the FAQs, there's like a week free for Simple Habit, if any of your viewers want to check it out. So using an app can be helpful just to kind of get going. That's not what's going to work for everyone, though. For some people, you might choose to get a coach, get somebody, like me or many of the other great meditation teachers out there who can support you in your practice and getting it started. But the main thing is to do it, right? So whether you sit and do it on your own or with an app or with a coach, the practice being consistent most days. So I love to say every day, but let's say 5 days a week. 5 days a week, you sit down for 10 or 15 minutes and you just pay attention to your breath, or you listen to the sounds around you, or you follow sensations in your body. Just that small commitment of 10 or 15 minutes, 5 days a week can really start to build up a practice, which then you can start to bring into day to day.
Yeah, no, I love that idea of starting small with it, because it can be really intimidating when someone says you have to do this 30 minutes and it's got to be 5 days a week. So taking it less structured, I think, is really helpful. How do you connect this, when we're talking about mindfulness and meditation and paying attention, how do you connect that to your sex life?
Well, For a lot of folks, there is a big emphasis on the mind during sex. There is a lot of anxiety around sex and around pleasure for all kinds of reasons. And there's a lot of different directions we could go talking about that. But in general, people are not in their bodies. They're not having an embodied experience of sex. They're having a somewhat embodied experience. They're feeling some of the pleasure, but oftentimes all the emphasis is on the orgasm, and there's not, or the climax. And so there's not necessarily an orgasmic experience throughout. It's like building to this one moment rather than getting to take in all the goodness of the entire experience, whether that's sex on your own or with a partner or partners. So the first step is really to start to bring your attention to your body. And so if you sit down and you do a pleasure awareness practice, let's say, where you're noticing things that feel good in your body and you're bringing your attention back each time you get pulled into the mind or get pulled into something else external, or an experience in the body that maybe isn't pleasant. You're just coming back again and again to this experience of pleasure in your body. That's going to start to attune you to pleasure throughout your day, including during sex. Another thing that I like to suggest to people is to have a daily pleasure awareness practice of 3 things, 3 moments of pleasure in your day. And so what you'll do is you'll just notice throughout the day anything that feels good. That could be everything from masturbation to eating a delicious sandwich to peeing when you really need to pee to drinking like a perfectly temperatured glass of water when you're thirsty. You notice these moments of pleasure and you lean into them. You attune to them. Then at the end of the day, write down 3 moments of pleasure that you've experienced. And it's kind of like a gratitude list. It's a pleasure list. And when you write down each of these experiences that you've had, take a moment to again sort of relive, re-experience the pleasure. And some of the experiences are going to be easy to relive. Some of them might be a little more abstract or kind of a little harder to tune into, but do your best to recreate that experience of pleasure in the body and feel it again. And so these 2 practices of sitting in meditation, noticing what feels good, and noting pleasure throughout the day and then reflecting on it can start to get you accustomed to feeling what's happening in the body when you're experiencing pleasure. Then you can also bring it into masturbation. There's an embodied self-pleasure practice I like to give folks. And then ultimately, you can start to be able to bring it into partnered sex. And it does get easier and easier with practice, just like learning to play the piano or any other sort of, skill. It's a skill to be able to attune to pleasure and to be able to attune to pleasure while with another person. And then from there, there's all kinds of ways you can build and expand your pleasure awareness as well as your sort of consciousness and wakefulness and connection during sex.
Yeah, I love that. Do you find that people have some resistance to doing these things? Because I know I've certainly run into resistance myself when trying to practice these.
Yeah, definitely. A lot of resistance can come up around being with pleasure. And, one reason is we're just not accustomed to it. We're used to paying attention to what doesn't feel good or being sort of lost in the mind. And so that's what we're used to. Those are the neural pathways that have been carved. And then there's also the negativity bias that we have as human beings. And if you add in, adversity and trauma, you're even more attuned to looking for the problem and trying to stay safe. And, the way that the world is these days, I was just remarking to my partner the other day, he was like trying to figure out some password for something and on his computer. And I was like, our brains just are not evolving at the pace that all of this stuff is evolving, and which, the whole singularity thing. And we're like stressed in this low level way all the time because of just the technology that we interface with every day. And, that's obviously a bigger conversation, but, we're really not attuned to feeling good. And we're all sort of hyper vigilant, hyper like aware of like, where's the threat, for good reason, right? We can look at what's been happening in our world, pretty easily see why we might be on high alert. But because of this, it's hard to slow down and just be with pleasure in the body. For some people, it might feel like, it might feel unsafe. Now, another reason it might feel unsafe is if the body is not a safe, hasn't been a safe place for us to be because of trauma, especially when we talk about, sexual pleasure. So many of us have experienced at least some level of sexual abuse or sexual harassment or sexual assault. I mean, it's sexual trauma is, I've rarely talked to someone who hasn't experienced it. And so being in the body might feel unsafe for that reason. So tuning into pleasure, especially sexual pleasure, there could be a lot of resistance that comes up around that. And that's why you just want to take it really slow and you want to be really resourced. So oftentimes, if I'm working with someone who's feeling a lot of resistance to paying attention to pleasure, we find ways to work with it that do feel safe. And that might be as simple as, let's just learn to focus on a place in our body that feels neutral. Just a place that feels neutral. And that can be a way to start. And that's a resource practice inspired by somatic experiencing, the work of Peter Levine. And by learning to resource, whether that's in an experience in our body or maybe something external, like looking around the space, just noticing that it's safe, there's no threat, or focusing in on a favorite color in your room, or listening to a song that just feels good. These kinds of practices, these resource practices, can start to help create a sense of safety. And then slowly we can start to graduate into like, okay, what's it like to be with pleasure in a more immediate way? What's it like to be with sensual or even sexual pleasure? And look, for some people, it's not about any of that. It's just like new. So there's like getting used to the new thing, and the part of us that's like a contrarian that wants to go to something other than what we're trying to focus on. So it doesn't need to be all about like trauma and hypervigilance. Sometimes it's just like, oh, I'm learning a new skill. I'm learning to focus on my body in this particular way. And again, it just takes practice.
Yeah, absolutely. As you're saying that, I'm reminded of kind of the concept in that when you focus on gratitude and what's feeling good, it actually rewires the brain. Is that part of what you do with your trauma work?
Yeah. So I definitely am all about let's rewire the brain towards pleasure. But again, that's different for everyone. So it's like, gotta work based on where we are. And so self-love comes in a lot, and self-compassion comes in a lot, and rewiring the brain towards self-love and self-compassion. I'm really inspired by EMDR as well. And while I'm not a therapist, so I'm not certified in EMDR, I do work with EMDR inspired practices and using a bilateral stimulation to kind of tap in positive experience and resource can be really, really helpful. Something I do a lot of for myself, but also invite my clients and students into as well. And it's a really powerful modality to help us strengthen our capacity to be with pleasure, strengthen our capacity to be with a positive experience. And when we run into those walls and it's like, whether it's like, I don't deserve it, or, I'm broken, it's not possible for me, bringing in self-love and self-compassion, there's lots of ways to do that, but that's a really, really important piece of all of this as well.
Yeah, yeah. And who is this kind of for? Like, what transformation do you see? Because when I observe people, I'm sometimes surprised that they're unaware that they're under a certain stress level that's keeping them locked up. And it's sometimes only when they have the experience that they start to recognize something's missing.
Mm. Yeah. I mean, I relate to that, right? Like there've been so many times in my life where I've been like, oh, wow, I had no idea. Like I remember when a couples therapist, and this was not that long ago, this was about maybe 7 or 8 years ago, couples therapist said to my partner, how do you relate to Jessica's anxiety? And I was like, I'm a meditation teacher. What are you talking about anxiety? And then I was like, oh yeah, my anxiety that I've lived with for most of my life. And yes, it changed in all kinds of ways at that point. Like I had healed and grown and gained lots of tools, but there was still this kind of anxiety there. And it really like at first I had a lot of resistance to it, but then I was like, oh, right. Like, this is just the work right now, is to like address this in a meaningful way. And so those moments where we realize that we've been unconscious around something, what amazing moments. And if we can teach ourselves to embrace and feel gratitude for those moments, awesome. Though I know that's hard to do, because it can be really frustrating when we find another layer of whatever it is, trauma, insecurity, anxiety, whatever it is, can feel like, but I already did all this work. Why do I have to keep working? And what I try to do with folks is just like really support the idea that this is a journey that we're on. It's a journey, and these are just invitations to like look at another aspect of the journey and to peel back another layer and to go deeper into the spiral of healing. And so, yeah, it's a beautiful thing to see people have those moments and then answer the call and experience the transformation that's possible, because it is possible. It's possible for all of us to continue to heal and awaken more deeply.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really beautiful thing. And I know that you've also offered like weekend meditations weekly, and then also meditation retreats. What is that like for you?
So I've been teaching meditation now for, I think it's been about 13 years. And I have this long running class on Sundays that it's showed up in all different forms, but right now it's on Facebook and Instagram Live. And it's a donation based class, and I love it. It's it's a beautiful community that's like evolved and changed in all kinds of ways over the years. It's really important for me to be able to offer what was offered to me. I had teachers who were able to offer me very low cost / free instruction, and so while I can't necessarily do that for people one-on-one, I try to find ways to be able to offer it, to be accessible for anyone, donation based. And so the meditation retreats, I've started doing that with my partner, Chris, and we offer it on a sliding scale and try to like make it as much like a residential meditation retreat as possible, even though it's virtual. And we had a really great experience last month with people from all over the world, that joined us for the retreat. And it's really special to see how spending 3 days or 4 days in silence and in practice can have such a profound effect on people. It was very cool to see. And I do other kinds of retreats and workshops as well. I did a sexual well-being retreat at Esalen last year, which was really cool. Really, really fun to see people go through that process. And it was, fun, but also some of it was quite challenging and deep. And to see people kind of show up and be willing to look at aspects of their sexuality and how more well-being could be brought in. So stuff like that is something that I do as well. And then, I'm really into human connection and self-compassion and self-love and sort of like the magical nature of all of that. So that's something I work with a lot as well.
Yeah, and I'm thinking of, because you came by the book club to answer some questions, I'm thinking about the fact that we teach mindfulness, we teach this holistic approach to health, the idea that taking care of yourself is related to your overall health. So maybe if you had a better diet, you wouldn't need the medication for X, Y, or Z. And then that you had noticed that there hadn't been somebody who'd really connected the mindfulness and the sex life, because your sex life is a huge piece of holistic health and how you feel about your body and how you feel the pleasure in your body. And I wanted to touch on that as to like why you originally wrote the book, Good Sex.
Yeah. So the good news is a lot of people are starting to talk about it now. Like
Yeah.
mindful sex is a thing now, which is just awesome. But yeah, when I first got interested in it, I had been meditating pretty seriously for about a year, I guess. And I came home from a meditation retreat. May not have been that long, may have been more like 6 months, but I came home from meditation retreat and I was like, okay, like meditation is blowing my mind. I'm like, there's been this massive paradigm shift. Like everything is more alive than it's ever been. And this has gotta have a place in sex. And I had gone through a period of celibacy, and I was in a relationship that was incredibly loving, but not necessarily um, sexually sort of free and abundant and, expressive. And so I started to do that exploration on my own because it wasn't really available in that relationship. And so I started bringing the meditation practices and the mindfulness into masturbation and into, my experience of reading erotica or watching porn, or, just the way I moved in my body. And I was seeking, books, teachers, something that I could kind of learn from. And I didn't really find it. I was finding orgasmic meditation, which I didn't feel drawn to. I was finding neo tantra, which I also didn't really feel drawn to because it felt very, and this has also been changing, but at the time it felt very heteronormative. It felt very like gendered. And I was like, that's not me. And there also was this sense of like drinking the Kool-Aid, like buying into the sort of dogma and the belief system. And while obviously I'm deeply inspired by all of these traditions, I wanted something that was like really down to earth and really secular and that I could relate to. And I just wasn't finding that. So ultimately, when that relationship ended and I entered a new one, I was like really ready for a sexual awakening, and I got it. And that led to me writing about sex and mindfulness and awakening. And I wrote for Deconstructing Yourself, which is a meditation blog and podcast. And then a publisher contacted me and said, hey, want to write this book. And, that's how I ended up writing the book. But it came from this desire to learn about something that I didn't hear anybody talking about. Like I wanted to know, like, what is something that's sex positive and, sexually like expressive and free and creative and spiritual look like? Because I wasn't finding it. Like, and even now, is like for me to say you can have a spiritual experience giving, a blowjob in a bathroom at a party to someone you don't really know. People are like, no, you can't. That's not spiritual. And it's like, what spiritual compared to what? Like what's not spiritual, first of all? And that's my question. But there's a lot of people who would like to bring these kinds of practices into sex that don't fit into this sort of monogamous, maybe vanilla sort of expression of sex. And so I like to speak to those varieties. I think it's important.
Yeah, I love that too, because you also highlighted in there watching porn and having a mindful experience. And I know that you talk about that specifically in the book, like these things that we've associated with being very bad or, addictive in nature, like porn can be. And what are your thoughts on all that and how you make it into a mindful experience?
Yeah, well, the number one thing is I'm really passionate about being conscious and ethical about the content one consumes. And it's inconvenient, because it means you can't just pop on Pornhub and watch whatever, just search whatever it is your thing is and watch it. It's like you actually need to be conscious about the process and seek out, companies and performers, and directors that are creating content that is ethical, where everyone's being treated fairly, where everyone's being paid well, where, consent and safety are number one. And that is available. right? That's very much available, but it is a matter of taking the time, taking the effort to find it, and then generally pay for it. And we don't want to pay for our porn because we can get it for free, right? But you know, for me, there's no other way at this point. Like I hit a point, I don't, you know, years ago now, where I was like, oh, I literally cannot look at that other content. Like it feels bad in my body. So ethical is number one. Then it's about, how am I taking this content in? Am I taking it in like, am I taking it in the way that I've been scrolling the last couple of days, given what happened at the Capitol, which is not conscious, right? Like I've just been like, oh God, you know, and having to take breaks. Or am I taking it in, you know, with mindfulness and presence, right? Like, am I aware of what's happening in my body? Am I at the very least like tuning into the pleasure associated with watching the porn? Am I getting in touch with all the different expressions of pleasure in my body as I view it? Am I, you know, like compulsively just watching, or am I letting my body sort of process the experience after I've viewed it? For obviously, there's a lot of downsides to porn, and science has been showing us this. I think there's also a lot of upsides. I think, like, just off the bat, like, you know, someone like me who deals with chronic pain, or, you know, someone who is living with a disability, maybe they can't have the sex that they want to have. Well, this is a way to engage with their sexuality, right? You know, what about a couple that is like running into a lot of challenges around desire levels or around creativity in their sexual life? Like this can be educational, right? Like there's a lot of different ways in which porn can be really supportive to our sex life. And the more that we bring in consciousness and mindfulness, the less likely we fall into the more destructive aspects of what it can do. I think we also want to talk to our kids about porn, and we want to talk to our kids about porn in a way that's not just black and white, like this is bad, but actually like from an early age, talk about it, because it is a part of our lives and your kids are going to see it. And so the more that we can be realistic about it and be like, look, this is a movie, like there's lights and cameras and these people are acting, like to really educate kids and talk about the pros and the cons of it. Like really a full spectrum is going to set our kids up to not necessarily fall into what we're seeing primarily with young boys and young men. So it starts at an early age, being conscious and mindful about the content.
Yeah, I found in the book club discussions, the idea of how we talk to kids about sex came up a lot, because there's a lot of parents in the book club. And I guess I'm wanting to associate the idea of shame and trauma and how we pass that down to the next generation by not being able to talk about these topics.
Yeah, man. Yeah, that generational trauma, whew, what a beast, right? That's, I mean, that's been my own personal journey of like healing my own trauma, which is, you know, an ongoing journey. And also addressing the generational trauma. And I don't believe this idea of you must perfectly heal your trauma before you have kids, like, because then nobody would have kids. Because it's like, it's a journey. It is a journey, and we can make great strides, and then we get to make more great strides. And so I think it's when it comes to sexuality, doing our own work is really incredibly important. And then, you know, being compassionate and kind with ourselves as we teach our kids, and being forgiving with ourselves when we make mistakes, when we screw up, because we're going to. I'm a real big fan of various trauma modalities, EMDR, somatic experiencing, but there's also like body work and vocal work and, you know, movement work and, you know, journaling and just, you know, so many different ways. And I think it's, if you have experienced any kind of trauma, that's like the best investment you can make in yourself, that you can make in future generations, and in a way that you can make in past generations. And I won't get too like metaphysical about it. Like I can just look at my own personal experience and see how my healing work has actually trickled backwards as well. And I've seen people in my family step into their own healing work. And that's not like me making that happen, but I am modeling something which can then have an effect. My grandmother came to this self-love sexuality workshop I did. And afterwards she said, I realized that there's this line that goes all the way back, like past my mother and past her mother. And the work that you're doing is like helping to heal that line. And that was probably one of the most meaningful things that anyone has ever said to me, because we do have that capability when we're willing to go in and do the work totally imperfectly, right? Like one day at a time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's in the very last chapter of your book, also talking about like, once you get started, here are places where that might be a pitfall. Like I know for me, wanting to get it perfect and then be like, okay, I got it. The trauma, the problems, poof, solved, done. And then a week goes by and something challenging comes up and you find that you're right back where you started. So like what kind of challenges do you see that people go through when they're going on this journey? Or have you gone through?
Yeah. I mean, I think grief is a big one.
Mhm.
I think there's a lot of grief, and that's I've done a lot of my own personal grief work, and I'm certified in the type of grief coaching. So I do a lot of that work with other people. And grief is a major, it can be a major wall that we hit. And no part of you wants to like sit in grief, right? Like it's like, no, it's horrible. But once you do, and this has been my experience, once I'm willing to, um, things soften and open, and insight comes in, and healing flows through. And the grieving process for me it comes in waves, right? Like there'll be a period where I'm not experiencing grief, and then I'll be like, oh wait, here I am grieving again, and I have to kind of like reset and be like, all right, I'm in grieving mode. And that doesn't need to look like my life stops and I'm like just lie in bed and cry, right? Maybe sometimes that is the thing that needs to happen, but it's about acknowledging and allowing for that grief to be present. So I think grief is something that we sometimes don't realize needs to be looked at and processed. Certainly, I think also that perfectionism, like you mentioned, really comes in, right? And this a bypassing of sorts, where it's like, well, it could be spiritual bypassing, right? Like I've had these insights and I'm one with everything, therefore I don't need to deal with my stuff. That can happen. But also just sort of bypassing by, picking up the phone 700 times a day, or being in relationships that keep us really distracted because they're so dysfunctional and dramatic. That could keep us from looking at our stuff. Overworking, taking in endless content and never allowing ourselves to integrate it, right? These can all be ways in which we bypass our experience. And so I think one of the main things that I do with people is help them to feel what they're feeling, to just slow down and feel it. And just feeling and maybe giving voice to that part of yourself, it's amazing what can happen. And this is something that I continue to do in my own life, right? Like, it's not like, oh, I did that and now I don't have to do that anymore. Like, no, I need to continue. And I do want to say that it absolutely gets better, right? Like for me, when I first started like my trauma healing work and sort of my sort of sexual expansion. I mean, I was always really into sex and always very sexual, but like there was a real demarcation line between like sex life before and sex life after, really bringing the spiritual path in. For me, when I started that journey of healing, I was in a place where if I was triggered, if my PTSD was triggered, and I wasn't even diagnosed at the time, but I would go into a place where um, a full a full sort of trauma response would occur, where my arms and legs would get ice cold because the blood was all going to my major organs to try to keep me alive. I would shake. My digestive system would go haywire. It would either like shut down and I would become constipated, or I'd be having diarrhea, or I'd throw up. My brain would freeze. I couldn't think. I couldn't speak. And this could last for long moments, or even an hour. But then the consequences of that, my body going into that place, would last for days, for months. And I came to realize, like, I was always in this low level fight, flight, freeze, and it was just waiting to be triggered. And that trauma response was intense. And when I was a teenager, I did not know what was happening to me. I thought, like, this is what it feels like when someone's going to cheat on you, so you better go and scream and yell at your girlfriend. Like, that's how I would think it was some sort of intuition or instinct, when really I was having a trauma response and my body thought it was going to die. And so, 10 years ago, when I was like, wait a second, I don't think this is okay that this happens to me, and I started the journey, it only took about a year before that stopped happening. It completely stopped happening. And between then and now, it's been this slow process of continuing to work with it. And I got to the place where I could notice just the teeniest trigger happening. Maybe I'd feel like my fingers get a little cold or a little quiver in my leg, and I could pause and use my tools and not go into that trauma response. And so I share that because it can feel like an endless dark pit when you're dealing with trauma. It's not. It can get better. It does get better. And it's something that having support with is really important. I got and continue to get a lot of support.
Yeah. That's a really beautiful story, and it's the kind of thing I've heard before, where people are learning for them what the trigger feels like, because I'm fascinated by the brain, even though I have no background with that. But the idea that we have an amygdala, we have an emotional response that causes these physical reactions in the body, and you do hang on to that for years. And you talked also about, like, the importance of, like, acknowledging and feeling grief. How do you start to identify the difference between, like, the kind of victim mindset of, like, a terrible thing happened to me, so it's okay that this bad thing happens to my body, or I can't control it, is a big one. How do you walk people from there to actually being able to say, oh, I'm being triggered, I'm going to stop and feel it, and I'm not going to go there again?
Yeah. Well, part of it is giving voice to all those young parts of self, or whatever part of self went through the trauma. Like, that's a really big aspect of it, because there are parts of us that are sort of stuffed down in the dark basement of our psyche, and that's what's getting triggered. And we need to see them and love them and let them have a voice. And so there is definitely a process of kind of untangling and unraveling these aspects of self that are in that space of truly being a victim, right? At some point, like a victim of whatever happened, untangling that from who we actually are today. And that, we can take care of ourselves today, and that we can create a safe life today. And so I do a lot of inner child work with people, and there's a lot of different modalities and ways to do that. But basically it comes down to, like, allowing those parts of self to speak, allowing those parts of self to do what they need to do, right? Like, I'll be working with someone like this on Zoom, and I'll say, okay, what would it feel like to turn off your camera so I can't see you, and go and hide under your bed, right? Like, they might say, this part of me just really doesn't want to be seen. It's feeling really scared. It's feeling like it wants to run away. And so we actually do that in the session. I'm like, okay, I want you to run away. I want you to, and I'm not going to see you. Nobody's going to see you, right? And bring your headset so, like, I can still hear you if you want to be heard, right? Or maybe it's just like, this isn't fair. No, I don't want this. Okay, so let's say no, and just, like, push that person or that experience, let the body process physically, mentally, verbally, emotionally, and that starts to integrate selves, and it starts to release that you know stored up trauma that's in the body and that's in the mind. And so that's a big part of it. And then, I'm not a mindset coach. That's not my deal. It's not what I do, but certainly addressing our mindset is important, and you do that healing work, you go into the space of victim, but then also you strengthen and support the part of you that knows that you're okay, this sort of like deep sense of well-being and of okayness. You recognize the things in life that you are able to do, that you are currently doing. You lean into that. And so I do a little bit of the dipping into the trauma itself, and then a lot of working with resource and working with acknowledging and celebrating the ways in which things are going well. And that's something I had to learn for myself, because before I really started my trauma journey in earnest, I was just doing a lot of meditation, and I was like sitting with the most painful, disturbing stuff with no resource. And so I kind of learned the hard way. And so now I'm like, it's like 75% like resource and support, and then like 25% we go into the more challenging material.
Nice. Well, that all sounds wonderful. Before I ask you my last question, where can people find you if they want more of this?
Sure. Yeah. I'm at yourwildsawakening.com. You can contact me through there, as well as get on my mailing list. And then I'm pretty active on Instagram, which is Jessica Clark Graham. And I live stream my Sunday classes on both Instagram and my personal page on Facebook, which is just /Graham Jessica on Facebook. So you can, and of course, those links are on my website as well. So you can find all of that there.
Great. And then my last question for you is, we're doing this in 2021. We've all been through a lot in the last year, and I'm sure more is to come. What advice would you have for people as a way to better get through this time, to better cope with all of what's coming up and the stressful situation we find ourselves in, like sheltering in place?
Yeah. Well, I think number one is to let go of the idea that there's some correct way to be going through this and that you're failing, which is what I know a lot of people are feeling, myself included sometimes, to like let go of this idea that there's a correct way to go through this. We don't know how to go through this. We've never gone through this. We're not going to do it perfectly. What is perfect in terms of this? And so to be really gentle and kind with yourself around that, and to just choose small things you can do each day. Right? Like, because there can be this sense of, okay, I need to like have this whole new workout routine, and I need to do this whole meal planning thing, and I need to, write 1,500 words a day, whatever it is. There's all these sort of self-improvement things we feel like we should be doing. But what if it's just, I'm going to make sure that I drink 1.5 liters of water, maybe 2 liters each day. I'm going to meditate for 2 minutes, like just small things. I'm going to get some sun on my face once a day. Just like tiny things that really do add up. I think that can be really helpful, because we definitely have this sense that we have to make these big moves, and no, just tiny little steps can make all the difference. And to just keep reminding yourself that you really are deserving of love and of kindness. And it's through that self-compassion and through that self-love and that self-exploration that you actually can show up and create positive change in the world, because the world needs you. And the more that you are resourced and taken care of within you, the more you can go out and be of service to others.
Wow, well said. Thank you so much for joining. For those that are watching, definitely check out Jessica's work. And if you don't have time to get to a meditation class or to go to one of those workshops, the book will walk you through it also. So thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe and comment, and we'll see you next week. Thank you so much for watching this week's episode. If you want to see more, go ahead and hit the subscribe button so that we end up in your feed. If you got something out of this personally that was helpful to you, also please leave a comment below. I love hearing the feedback about what's working and what's not. That's what makes this show better. And until next time, love you more, and we'll see you then.